20 horrible Wild West facts history school doesn't teach. Did you know that Jesse James wasn't the charming outlaw Hollywood made him out to be, but rather a ruthless criminal? Ready to dive into some of the most shocking facts about this wild era that history class conveniently skipped over?
Not what I want!
Number one, the brutality of frontier justice. The Wild West is often romanticized as a land of rugged cowboys and daring adventures, but the reality was far more brutal, especially when it came to justice. Frontier justice was a harsh and often cruel system, characterized by lynch mobs and vigilante actions. It wasn't uncommon for accused individuals to be executed without a fair trial, a stark contrast to the due process we expect today. The image of a judge and jury deliberating over evidence was more the exception than the rule in many frontier towns. One of the most notorious figures associated with this era of rough justice was Judge Isaac Parker, often referred to as the hanging judge. Serving as a federal judge for the Western District of Arkansas, which included Indian Territory, Parker presided over an area rife with lawlessness and crime. His jurisdiction was vast, covering over 74,000 square miles, and he was tasked with bringing order to a region notorious for its outlaws and bandits. Judge Parker's reputation as the hanging judge stemmed from his prolific use of the death penalty. During his 21 years on the bench, he sentenced 160 people to death, and 79 of those sentences were carried out. This was a time when the concept of rehabilitation was virtually non-existent, and the emphasis was squarely on deterrence and punishment. Public hangings were a common spectacle, serving as both a form of punishment and a grim deterrent to others who might consider breaking the law. Number 2. Native American genocide. When we think about the history of the Wild West, it's impossible to ignore the tragic and often brutal treatment of Native American tribes. This period was marked by a systematic campaign of displacement and extermination as the U.S. government and settlers sought to expand westward, often at the expense of the indigenous populations who had lived on these lands for centuries. One of the most heartbreaking examples of this is the Trail of Tears. In the early 1830s, the U.S. government, under President Andrew Jackson, enforced the Indian Removal Act, which aimed to relocate Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. The policy was driven by the desire to access and exploit the fertile lands that these tribes occupied. The Trail of Tears refers specifically to the forced removal of the Cherokee Nation, but it also affected the Muskogee, or Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. The journey was grueling and deadly. Thousands of Native Americans were forced to march over 1,200 miles, often under harsh conditions and with inadequate supplies. Many suffered from exposure, disease, and starvation. It's estimated that approximately 4,000 Cherokee people died during this forced relocation, a tragic toll that underscores the cruelty and disregard for human life during this period. Number 3. The Notorious Outlaws, Beyond the Myths. When you hear names like Jesse James and Billy the Kid, you might picture daring heists and gunfights, the kind of romanticized tales that have been portrayed in countless movies and books. But the real stories of these infamous outlaws are much darker and more violent than the legends suggest. Jesse James, for example, is often depicted as a Robin Hood-like figure, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. The reality, however, is far more brutal. Jesse James, along with his brother Frank, led the James Younger Gang, a notorious group of outlaws who terrorized the Midwest after the Civil War. Their criminal exploits were marked by a series of bank and train robberies, many of which ended in bloodshed. One of the most infamous incidents involving Jesse James was the robbery of the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota in 1876. The gang planned to rob the bank, believing it held a large sum of cash. However, things quickly went awry. The townspeople fought back fiercely and a deadly shootout ensued. 2 members of the gang were killed and the rest barely escaped, some with serious injuries. The failed robbery marked the beginning of the end for the James Younger Gang, as law enforcement intensified their efforts to capture them. Billy the Kid, another well-known figure, was a young outlaw whose life was marked by violence from an early age. He was involved in the Lincoln County War, a bloody conflict in New Mexico that pitted 2 rival factions against each other. Billy the Kid, whose real name was Henry McCarty, was notorious for his quick draw and willingness to kill. He is credited with having killed at least 8 men, although some estimates put that number higher. Number 4. The harsh life of cowboys. When we think of cowboys, we often picture rugged heroes riding across vast landscapes, but the reality of cowboy life is far from glamorous. These men faced grueling and dangerous conditions daily, working long hours for little pay. The life of a cowboy was marked by physical exhaustion, harsh weather, and the constant threat of injury or illness. Cowboys spent most of their time on cattle drives, which could last for months. They endured scorching heat, biting cold, and torrential rains, all while sleeping under the open sky. The work itself was tough and often dangerous. Rounding up cattle, branding, and protecting the herd from rustlers and predators required constant vigilance. The pay was meager, often just a few dollars a month, barely enough to cover basic needs. One of the lesser-known hazards of cowboy life was a condition known as cowboy tuberculosis, or more accurately, dust pneumonia. This illness was caused by the inhalation of dust and dirt kicked up by the cattle and the dry, windy conditions on the plains. Cowboys often developed chronic respiratory problems from breathing in this dust, leading to severe lung issues that could be debilitating or even fatal. The romantic image of the cowboy overlooks these harsh realities. While they were often celebrated as symbols of freedom and rugged individualism, cowboys were hard-working laborers facing some of the toughest conditions in the American West. Number 5. The plight of Chinese immigrants. The story of Chinese immigrants in the Wild West is one of exploitation and discrimination. These immigrants played a crucial role in building the railroads and connecting the country, as well as working in mines and other labor-intensive industries. However, they faced harsh working conditions, low wages, and widespread racism. Chinese workers were instrumental in constructing the Transcontinental Railroad, especially through the treacherous Sierra Nevada mountains. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions, often during the most perilous tasks like blasting through rock. Despite their significant contributions, they were paid less than their white counterparts and were forced to live in segregated camps under poor conditions. The discrimination didn't stop at the workplace. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a federal law that explicitly targeted Chinese immigrants, banning further immigration and preventing those already in the country from becoming citizens. This law institutionalized racial discrimination and reflected the widespread anti-Chinese sentiment of the time. Number 6. The dark side of mining boomtowns. Mining boomtowns sprang up almost overnight as gold and silver were discovered across the West. These towns promised riches and opportunity, drawing people from all over. However, the reality of life in a boomtown was often grim, marked by lawlessness, vice, and violence. Boomtowns were notoriously rough places. With the influx of prospectors and fortune seekers came an equally large number of opportunists looking to make a quick buck through less savory means. Prostitution and gambling were rampant, and many towns had a saloon on every corner. These establishments were not just places for socializing, they were often fronts for illegal activities and providing fertile ground for conflict and crime. The law was frequently absent or unable to keep up with the rapid growth of these towns. This lack of law enforcement led to frequent gunfights and other violent confrontations. One of the most notorious boomtowns was Bodie, California, known for its frequent gunfights and high crime rate. The town became infamous for its lawlessness, earning the moniker Bad Man's Bodie. Number 7. The struggles of women on the frontier. The romanticized image of the Wild West often overlooks the harsh realities faced by women on the frontier. Life was tough and dangerous, and women had to navigate a world where they were often treated as second-class citizens with few legal rights and protections. They were expected to handle a wide range of responsibilities, from household chores to farming, often with little support. One group of women who faced particularly difficult conditions were the soiled doves, a euphemism for prostitutes. Many women found themselves in this line of work out of desperation. Economic opportunities for women were extremely limited, and prostitution offered a means to earn a living, albeit at great personal cost. These women faced not only social stigma, but also violence and exploitation. They worked in rough conditions, often under the control of unscrupulous madams or brothel owners, and lacked any legal protections. Another difficult path for women on the frontier was that of the mail-order bride. Due to the gender imbalance in many frontier towns, women were in high demand, leading some men to seek wives through mail-order services. Women, often from more populated and economically struggling areas, would agree to marry men they had never met in person. The reality for many of these women was far from the romantic adventure they might have imagined. They faced isolation, harsh living conditions, and sometimes abusive relationships, far away from any support network. Number 8. The horrors of Indian boarding schools. One of the darkest chapters in American history involves the Indian boarding schools, where Native American children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to be assimilated into Euro-American culture. The goal of these schools, established in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was to strip Native children of their cultural identities and integrate them into mainstream American society. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania is one of the most notorious examples. Founded in 1879 by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, the school's motto was "Kill the Indian, Save the Man," reflecting its mission to eradicate Native American culture. Children were taken from their families, sometimes forcibly, and sent to schools far from their homes. Once there, they were subjected to harsh discipline and a strict regime designed to eliminate their native languages, customs, and beliefs. The conditions in these schools were often appalling. Children faced physical and emotional abuse and were punished for speaking their native languages or practicing their traditions. The schools enforced military-style discipline, with children wearing uniforms and being subjected to harsh punishments for minor infractions. The emotional toil was immense, as many children were separated from their families for years, losing touch with their cultural roots. Number 9. the exploitation of African American cowboys and settlers. The contributions of African Americans to the history of the Wild West are often overlooked, yet they played a significant role as cowboys, settlers, soldiers, and pioneers. Despite the challenges of discrimination and limited opportunities, African American men and women helped shape the American frontier in profound ways. One of the most notable groups was the Buffalo Soldiers, African American regiments in the U.S. Army who were stationed on the frontier. These soldiers served in some of the most challenging and dangerous environments, engaging in battles against Native American tribes and outlaws and protecting settlers. Despite their vital service, the Buffalo Soldiers faced discrimination within the Army and in the communities they served. They often received the worst assignments and were subject to harsher discipline compared to their white counterparts. African American cowboys also played a crucial role in the cattle industry. It's estimated that 1 in 4 cowboys was African American. These men worked alongside white and Mexican cowboys, herding cattle, breaking horses, and driving cattle to market. Despite their significant contributions, African American cowboys faced racial prejudice and were often relegated to the lowest paying jobs and the most difficult tasks. They were also often excluded from the romanticized narratives of the cowboy lifestyle, which were predominantly whitewashed in popular culture. Number 10. The dangers of frontier medicine. Living on the frontier was a challenge in many ways, and one of the most perilous aspects was the limited access to medical care. Frontier medicine was primitive by today's standards, with few doctors and even fewer resources. This lack of medical knowledge and equipment often led to high mortality rates from illnesses and injuries that might be considered minor today. Common deadly illnesses on the frontier included cholera, typhoid fever, and smallpox. These diseases spread rapidly in crowded conditions, such as mining camps or military forts, where sanitation was poor and water sources were often contaminated. Smallpox, in particular, was a devastating disease that could wipe out entire communities, especially among Native American populations who had no immunity to it. Cholera outbreaks were also frequent, usually caused by contaminated drinking water. The lack of clean water and proper sanitation made it easy for such diseases to spread unchecked. When it came to injuries, the situation wasn't much better. Accidents were common, whether from farming, hunting, or simple mishaps, and the treatments available were often crude and painful. Surgery was usually performed without anesthesia, using rudimentary tools. Amputations, for example, were a common response to severe injuries or infections, and were done with nothing more than a shot of whiskey and a bone saw. Number 11. The reality of manifest destiny. The concept of manifest destiny was a driving force behind the westward expansion of the United States in the 19th century. This ideology held that Americans were divinely ordained to expand across the continent, spreading their way of life and civilization. While it was a rallying cry for settlers seeking new opportunities, it often resulted in violent land grabs and conflicts, particularly with Native American tribes. One of the key justifications for this expansion was the doctrine of discovery, a legal principle that granted European settlers the right to claim lands not inhabited by Christians. This doctrine was used to legitimize the taking of Native American lands, under the belief that these lands were empty or unused, despite the presence of thriving indigenous cultures. The reality was that these lands were home to diverse communities with deep connections to their territories. The Indian Wars are a stark example of the conflicts sparked by manifest destiny. As settlers moved west, they encroached on Native American lands, leading to a series of violent clashes. These wars were marked by brutal tactics and massacres, such as the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Wounded Knee Massacre. Native American tribes were systemically displaced, their lands confiscated, and their populations decimated by warfare and disease. Number 12. The environmental impact of westward expansion. The westward expansion of the United States was not just a human and cultural phenomenon, it also had profound environmental impacts. As settlers moved into new territories, they brought with them practices that dramatically altered the landscape, often with little regard for the long-term consequences. One of the most significant environmental impacts was the near extinction of the American bison. Once numbering in the tens of millions, bison were a keystone species on the Great Plains, crucial to the ecosystem and the livelihoods of many Native American tribes. However, as settlers moved west, they hunted bison extensively, both for their hides and as a means of undermining Native American tribes that relied on the bison for food, clothing, and tools. The U.S. government encouraged this slaughter as a way to force Native Americans onto reservations by eliminating their primary food source. By the late 19th century, the bison population had been reduced to a few hundred individuals, a dramatic decline that nearly wiped out the species. Deforestation was another major consequence of westward expansion. As settlers built towns and railroads, they cleared vast tracts of forest for timber and farmland. This deforestation had significant ecological consequences, including soil erosion, loss of habitat for wildlife, and changes to local climate patterns. The rapid expansion of agriculture also led to overgrazing and depletion of soil nutrients, making the land less productive over time. Number 13. The cruelty of frontier schools. Frontier schools were far from the idyllic one-room schoolhouses often depicted in nostalgic tales. In reality, these schools were harsh places with tough disciplinary practices and inadequate facilities. The conditions were challenging, not just for students, but also for the teachers who often worked with minimal resources. Corporal punishment was a common disciplinary method, reflecting the tough, no-nonsense attitude of the time. Teachers, who were often just a few years older than their students, had to maintain strict discipline in classrooms that were frequently overcrowded and underfunded. The punishments could be severe, including whipping, spanking, or making students stand in uncomfortable positions for long periods. These methods were intended to maintain order and instill discipline, but they often crossed the line into cruelty. The facilities themselves were usually inadequate. Many frontier schools were nothing more than log cabins or rough-hewn buildings, lacking basic amenities like heating or proper insulation. In winter, students and teachers alike would shiver in the cold, while in the summer they sweltered in the heat. School supplies were scarce, with students sometimes sharing textbooks and using slates instead of paper. Despite these challenges, education was highly valued, and families made great sacrifices to send their children to school, often walking miles each day.
Can you give me a sentence with the word Isthmus in it?
This must be my lucky day.
Number 14. The realities of homesteading. Homesteading is often romanticized as a life of independence and self-sufficiency, but the reality is much harsher. Early settlers faced numerous challenges, from isolation to severe weather and the constant threat of crop failures.
Cow work means long hours, hard work, offers little pay. An average starting salary.
Isolation was one of the most difficult aspects of homesteading. Many families settled far from towns or other homesteaders, often miles away from the nearest neighbor. This isolation could be both physically and emotionally taxing, especially during harsh winters when snow made travel impossible. Social interactions were limited, and the loneliness could be overwhelming, particularly for women who were often left alone while their husbands worked long hours in the fields. The weather was another significant challenge. Homesteaders faced extreme conditions, from scorching summers to bitterly cold winters. Droughts could destroy crops, while floods and storms could wipe out entire fields. The unpredictable nature of the weather made farming a constant gamble. Crop failures were common, and without modern farming techniques or irrigation, many families struggled to produce enough food to survive.
Then they don't pay much on this kind of job. And I'm proud of it, and I guess I'm going to stay until I die.
Number 15. The deadly duels and gunfights.
Stand there, boys. Get him.
The image of gunfights in the Wild West is one of the most enduring myths, thanks largely to Hollywood.
Now we've done it.
While these duels weren't as common as the movies suggest, they did occur and were often deadly. One of the most famous gunfights was the gunfight at the OK Corral, which took place in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881.
That's that old rip. Makes me laugh.
The gunfight at the OK Corral involved a showdown between the Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, and Doc Holliday on one side, and the Clanton and McClory brothers on the other. The feud had been brewing for some time, fueled by tensions between the lawmen and a group of outlaws known as the Cowboys. The gunfight lasted only about 30 seconds, but it was deadly, with 3 men killed and several others wounded. This incident has been romanticized in countless films and books, but it was a brutal and chaotic event. Another notable example is the exploits of the James Younger Gang. This gang, led by Jesse James and his brother Frank, was involved in numerous robberies and shootouts across the Midwest. Their criminal activities often resulted in violent confrontations with law enforcement and civilians. The gang's notoriety grew after the failed Northfield, Minnesota bank robbery, where the townspeople fought back, leading to a bloody shootout. Number 16. The prevalence of disease and epidemics. Disease was a constant threat in the Wild West, with outbreaks of illnesses like cholera, smallpox, and tuberculosis often proving fatal. The lack of medical knowledge and infrastructure made it difficult to prevent or treat these diseases, leading to high mortality rates. Cholera was particularly feared because of its rapid onset and high fatality rate. It was spread through contaminated water, which was a common problem in frontier towns and mining camps where sanitation was poor. Outbreaks of cholera could decimate communities, as there was no effective treatments at the time. People often resorted to folk remedies, which were usually ineffective and sometimes harmful. Smallpox was another devastating disease, especially for Native American populations who had no immunity to it. The introduction of smallpox by European settlers and traders led to catastrophic epidemics among indigenous communities, killing vast numbers of people. These epidemics weakened many tribes, making it easier for settlers to take over their lands. The U.S. government sometimes used smallpox as a weapon, distributing infected blankets to Native American tribes in a form of biological warfare. Number 17. The exploitation of Mexican Americans.
There is a special bond that exists between these men. They've worked.
The westward expansion of the United States led to significant exploitation and discrimination against Mexican Americans, particularly in the Southwest. This period saw the displacement of many Mexican landowners and the imposition of discriminatory laws and practices.
Today, there are only a few of them left. They are vaqueros.
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War in 1848, promised to protect the property rights of Mexican citizens in the newly acquired territories.
The roundup. A ritual just as old and as much a part of the cattle industry as the vaquero is still practiced here.
However, in practice, many Mexican Americans lost their lands through legal manipulation, fraudulent claims, and outright seizure. The California Land Act of 1851, for instance, required landowners to prove their ownership in American courts, a process that was expensive and complicated. Many Mexican landowners, unable to navigate the legal system or afford the costs, lost their lands. Mexican Americans also faced widespread discrimination in employment and social settings. They were often paid lower wages than white workers and were excluded from many jobs and professions. In the legal system, they were frequently denied justice, facing biased courts and juries. The racial prejudices of the time portrayed Mexican Americans as inferior, leading to social and economic marginalization. Number 18. The struggles of frontier law enforcement. Being a lawman on the frontier was a challenging and often dangerous job. Law enforcement officers faced overwhelming challenges, from the vast and often lawless territories they patrolled to the corruption and violence they permeated many frontier towns.
Hurts, don't it?
One of the most famous lawmen of the Wild West was Wyatt Earp, known for his role in the gunfight at the OK Corral. Earp, along with his brothers and Doc Holliday, faced off against the Clanton-McClary gang in a deadly shootout that became legendary. However, the reality of Earp's career, like that of many frontier lawmen, was far more complex. He operated in a world where the line between law enforcement and law breaking was often blurred.
U.S. Marshal for this territory.
Forget it. I'm retired.
Excuse me?
I said forget it. I don't want the job.
Many lawmen were former outlaws or gamblers, and they sometimes used their positions for personal gain.
Well, you're a witness to it. So you're Jack Wilson.
Corruption was a significant issue in many frontier towns. Lawmen were often underpaid, making them susceptible to bribery and other forms of corruption. Some lawmen ran protection rackets or turned a blind eye to illegal activities in exchange for a cut of the profits. This corruption made it difficult for honest lawmen to do their jobs and contributed to the lawlessness of many frontier towns.
That's that old rip.
That don't.
Makes me laugh.
Number 19. The dangers of railroad construction.
I've been so Susie had Billy Roll. I don't know, but I...
The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was a monumental achievement, but it came at a significant human cost. The work was dangerous and grueling, with laborers facing harsh conditions, hazardous tasks, and exploitation. One of the most dangerous aspects of railroad construction was the use of dynamite and other explosives to blast through mountains and create tunnels. This work was perilous, with workers often handling unstable explosives in poorly ventilated and unsafe conditions. Accidents were common, and many workers lost their lives in explosions or rock slides. The labor force for the railroads was diverse, including many Chinese immigrants who faced particularly harsh conditions and discrimination. Chinese workers were often given the most dangerous and least desirable jobs, such as laying track in remote and difficult terrain or working in the tunnels. They were paid less than their white counterparts and lived in segregated camps with poor living conditions.
I've been so Susie had Billy Roll. I don't know, but I...
Despite these challenges, the Chinese workers were instrumental in their completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, showcasing remarkable skill and resilience. The construction crews also faced environmental hazards, such as extreme weather conditions, from blistering heat to cold. Workers had to deal with harsh winters in the mountains, where avalanches and blizzards could isolate them from supplies. In the plains, they faced scorching heat and the threat of prairie wildfires. These conditions made the work even more grueling and dangerous. Number 20. The scandalous side of Western heroes.
That's an experiment.
Watch it.
The Wild West is full of larger-than-life figures, often celebrated as heroes, but many of these individuals had dark or scandalous aspects to their lives.
About there'll do.
Figures like Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody, while famous for their exploits, also had controversial and sometimes questionable pasts. Wild Bill Hickok is often remembered as a legendary lawman and gunslinger, known for his sharpshooting skills and daring adventures. However, Hickok's life was also marked by gambling, brawling, and a series of failed business ventures.
Looks like we're shy of one horse.
He killed several men in shootouts, some of which were shrouded in controversy. Buffalo Bill Cody, another iconic figure of the Wild West, was known for his Wild West shows that portrayed a romanticized version of frontier life.
You brought too many.
While Cody played a significant role in the shaping of popular image of the American West, his shows were often criticized for their sensationalism and inaccuracies. He exaggerated his exploits as a buffalo hunter and Indian fighter to create a larger-than-life persona. Additionally, his shows often perpetuated stereotypes about Native Americans and glossed over the harsh realities of frontier life. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.